Hello and welcome to Monday Night Travel Season 5 with Rick Steves Pro. My name is Gabe Gunning, and I have the privilege of serving as your moderator this evening as Rick whisks us from Europe to Asia and from Central America to the Middle East to teach us how we can apply the lessons we learn abroad to our communities back home. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn things over to the man, the myth, the traveler. It's Rick Steves. Rick, over to you.
Thank you, Gabe, the man, the myth, the traveler. Well, I'll take that. Hey, it is so nice to be able to get together. I've just been enjoying a great trip in Europe. I got home just a few days ago, and we were filming in France. Did a beautiful 1-hour show on Paris. We were doing our gourmet barge tour through Burgundy, and I can hardly wait to share some ideas on that with you all. And then on my way home, rather than flying from Europe all the way to Seattle, I stopped off in Cincinnati and did a few concerts there with the wonderful Cincinnati Pops, hosting our symphonic journey, giving American music lovers a chance to touch down in 7 different countries there musically. And then traveled over to North Carolina to Asheville and visited the Transylvania County Library and Brevard College and had a wonderful crowd there to share what I call Travel as a Political Act, my lecture that shares with my travelers the perspectives that I have enjoyed after spending a third of my adult life living out of a 9 by 22 by 14 inch carrying the airplane sized suitcase and finding out that this world is filled with different ideas and people that are enjoying the same challenges and the same thrills in their lives as we are. And the more we travel, the more we realize we have in common. So we have a big election coming up, and I just thought this election is really important, and I feel really good about the perspective that my travels have given me, and I've enjoyed the affirmation of that by other travelers who really are inspired to bring the world into the voting booth when they go and exercise this very important right and privilege that we have as Americans. And I thought what I'd like to do is take about an hour and a quarter, and review the issues that I think are important and hope that you can learn from my experience in a way that helps you vote more in line with your values. I have this notion that if everybody traveled before we voted, the world would be a more just and a more stable and a more sustainable place, a happier place. And of course, we can't have that as a prerequisite for voting, but we can celebrate the value of travel. I've often thought that if the world wanted to do a very smart investment, they would pass the hat around, establish a fund, and give every American, when they're finished with school, before they get into the workforce, a little vacation. An all expenses paid vacation, thanks to the rest of the world, so Americans could better understand our world, and then be better citizens of the planet, as well as more thankful Americans. That's my story. And what I'd like to do now is to acknowledge that this is unusual for me to give a talk about political issues relating specifically to an election. And I don't want to say Kamala Harris and Donald Trump very much at all tonight. I want to talk about issues and then make the issues clear and then talk more about the inclination of parties to support this or that side of that issue. And then we can all, draw our own conclusions on what is the best way for us to vote. But basically, I want to explain why I think it's important to take with us a global perspective into the voting booth. So thank you so much for joining me. I've got some slides I put together I just rummaged through my slides and found a bunch of slides that illustrate points that I'd like to make. And we're going to do that right now. And of course, afterwards, we'll have questions, and I'd love to answer your questions, and that'll come up after my presentation. But this is all about voting with a traveler's perspective in the coming election. And when I think about that, I think of my work. Of course, our beat is Europe. Our mission is to equip and inspire Americans to venture beyond Orlando. And the first sort of the springboard for world exploration would be Europe. And we've written all sorts of books about traveling in Europe. 3 books that really lay out my philosophy are Europe Through the Back Door, which is the skills. That's the foundation. Europe 101, which is history, art, and culture. That helps us understand the peoples and the communities that we're visiting. And Travel as a Political Act. And Travel as a Political Act is the book that I've written that collects the most important experiences I've had in a lifetime of being curious, of getting out of my comfort zone. And this is the book that really collects the most impactful lessons I've learned on the road. For me, the road is school, and this is a good chance to get really good on the world, I think, is to have these experiences. So this is kind of the textbook today. And I do want to remind you that the backstory of what I'll be talking about is by and large in here. And there's a lot more information here than I can ever cover tonight. And we decided to basically blow through these books. They retail for $20, and we'll be selling them for half price for the next 3 days on our website. For $10, you can get that. And I do want to remind you that ever since I first published this book, all of the royalties have gone directly to Bread for the World to help fight hunger. That's the organization I like in Washington, D.C., that advocates in the halls of Congress to help our government be more sensitive to the needs of hungry people. Not just because that's love your neighbor, but because that's an investment in a stable and a just world, which is a nicer place for our children to live in. That's kind of a theme I'll come back to tonight several times, is how love your neighbor is a beautiful thing, but it's also, for those who really aren't that into love your neighbor, it's also a practical investment in a more stable world. It's a beautiful thing to get that figured out. So I've spent about 3 months a year, ever since I was this kid, exploring. And I've explored with a spirit of adventure, and I have found that Europe is a wonderful classroom to learn more about our own country. If you've heard me talk before, you know I love this notion that you can learn a lot about your own home by leaving it and looking at it from a distance. I've done a lot of that. I've talked to a lot of smart people in Europe who love their style, and we love our style, and it's helped me vet and test truths that I was raised thinking were self-evident and God-given. And it's amazing how even the least ethnocentric of us, among us, we're pretty ethnocentric because we don't even realize it, but we really are raised to know that the American way is the right way. I find it humbling to get out there and hang out with people who, again, find different truths to be self-evident and God-given. That helps me not be ethnocentric, and that's what the traveler gets. And I'm also a historian. I got my degree in history, and that lets me get an appreciation for this perspective, going back in time. So I can go across countries and I can go back in time. And if I think about that in a way to how to be a good global citizen, I think it adds up pretty nicely. Now, Europe is our sort of sister society, and that's my beat. And when you go to Europe, you're going to a continent that is not very church-going, especially up in the north. I find the most wealthy societies are the ones that are the most self-assured, and they're the ones that seem to need the religion the least. But I think up in Scandinavia, for example, the most really satisfied corner of Europe in so many ways, they have a religion which is a civic religion. And if you look at each of the capitals, you'll find the biggest building that sits there with its bell tower, just like a church, is actually the city hall. This is the city hall in Stockholm. This is the city hall in Oslo. And when you step into that city hall, you find that the murals and the mosaics don't celebrate Bible stories. They celebrate great mythic characters in their own society. Heroes who have gone way beyond the normal call of duty as citizens to make their society thrive. It's a fascinating thing to see these city halls that feel like churches in your travels. And I find that Europeans in general have more of that appreciation of, we're in this together. We've got to all contribute. Scandinavians are more comfortable paying higher taxes in order to do things collectively. They don't think it's expensive to pay high taxes. They just would rather have the government work in a more efficient and equitable way to provide health care and retirements and education and so on. Now, it is fun when we look at these different societies to see how they're not very consistent. Everybody's got their own style. Europeans aren't that excited about wearing helmets on their bikes, and Americans are just appalled. How awful to be riding around on bikes with little kids without helmets. And but on the other hand, the Europeans would be how appalling it is in the United States that we have so many guns, and they have almost no guns. So each society has its own passions, the things that they get and the things that they don't get. And I love to compare notes And I do that in a way to learn so I can come home and help our society get it right. It's fun to compare notes. When it comes to gun violence, just today, in Alabama, I think it was, there was a mass murder, and there's 4 or 5 people killed and 17 people injured, and it's just almost routine now. I think we need to remember that in the United States, there are about 100,000 murders a year. There are about, I think, 13,000 killings by guns a year, and in Europe, in Germany, there's 80 a year. In Norway, there's about 10 or 15 a year. It's amazing how gun violence in Europe is just a tiny sliver of what we have. How does that happen? Governance. It happens by governments reflecting the will of the people to come down hard on this or come down hard on that. Every country gets to finesse that the way they want to. It's interesting when I'm in Europe to kind of think of what is the political makeup of Europe compared to the political environment in the United States. In the United States, we're quite divided, and we know we've got the Trump base, and we've got all the liberal elites, or whatever we want to call that. And when we go to Europe and other democracies, we find that this is a time of division as well in other countries. I was just in Dresden, in Eastern Germany, and this was just a couple months ago. And there was a rally, and it was the perfect equivalent of the Trump base on the streets with angry "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and their ideas about Putin and Ukraine, and it was a tense situation. And the police were there dividing the Trump base of the equivalent of the Trump base with the liberals that wanted to shout them down. I wasn't even able to get very close on this photograph because it was that much tension. But all over Europe, we have those divided, that division, and it is, I think, symptomatic of the fact that in every society there are people who feel marginalized. There are people who feel they're not being heard. There are people that are feeling like they're not getting a fair chance, and they hit the streets. So this is a reality, and when we think about that sort of what we consider the Trump base, it's interesting to look at it in different societies. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, there was a superstar in Italy named Diego Maradona in the soccer or football. And today, when you walk the streets of the poor cities, the working class cities, the rundown quarters of the wrong side of the track in cities, you find Maradona is like a saint. I mean, it's amazing. You walk around Naples, and everywhere you look, there are posters that show him in a sort of divine kind of way. The god Diego Maradona. What is the deal? Well, Naples is one big Trump base of people that are feeling like they're not being heard, like they don't have hope, like the system is rigged against them. Milano or Torino or the more wealthy industrial cities, Maradona is not even registering there. But for the people who are upset and angry in Naples, the soccer field is the great equalizer. You can put 11 people on the field from Naples under the leadership of Maradona, and they can beat Milano. And that just gives them hope. And it's a fascinating sort of energy. And it reminds me that it is very important for communities to live together to try to gain an empathy for what is animating the people that seem to be so opposed to what another part of society thinks is important. Of course, when I'm traveling around the United States, I really find that if I can go to a more conservative community that doesn't travel as much, perhaps, I can find that my lectures get more traction. They have a bigger impact. I was just in Abilene, in Texas, giving my Travel as a Political Act talk to a packed out theater. And it was fun. And everybody was there, and it was stimulating, and I was getting people out of their comfort zones. And I just felt, as a travel teacher, very gratified to be able to go into a community that really didn't have the advantage, as much as many privileged communities would have, of getting out there and exploring the world. And it reminded me how much fear is impacting our society today. When I started traveling, people said bon voyage. And now they say have a safe trip. And as I like to say when I'm giving my lectures, when somebody tells me I have a safe trip, I'm inclined to say, well, you have a safe stay at home. Because where I'm going, statistically, and I know statistics are optional these days, but where I'm going statistically is safer than where you're staying. In fact, if you love your kids, you'll take them to Europe tomorrow. This is how we sell tours. I just don't understand this have a safe trip business, because statistically it is safer now to go to Europe than to stay in the United States. And statistically it is safer to travel now than it was back when people said bon voyage. What is with this fear of the rest of the world? Well, I think fear is for people who don't get out very much. And I found that the flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain understanding when we travel. And I've thought long and hard about this, and it occurs to me, I'm not particularly courageous. I've just seen the world more, and I'm not afraid of it. Who would be more afraid of it? Somebody who's never traveled. Where's the most frightened corners of our society? It's the corners with no passports, where people have not gone out of their comfort zones. That is sad to me, that there are huge swaths of our society whose understanding of the world is shown to them by commercial news media. And that news media oftentimes peddles fear in order to get more ratings and to charge more for their ads. And what happens is you have a whole class of people that aren't privileged enough or able enough or curious enough to travel, and they're frightened. And their worldview is shaped by commercial news media. And then you have a whole class of people who are privileged enough to travel, and their worldview is shaped by actual firsthand experiences. How do I feel so strongly the way I feel that the world is filled with beautiful people and lots of love and families just like ours? I've spent 100 days a year since I was a kid hanging out with them overseas. I come home and people don't get that, and they haven't traveled. So if we've been blessed enough to travel, we have this opportunity not to be afraid and to share that with our neighbors. The most impactful event, perhaps, in my career as a traveler was on my very first trip. I was in Oslo with my mom and dad. I was just 14 years old. And I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents took me to the park, and I remember they were just loving me inexplicably. And they didn't have a lot of money. It was their first time in Europe. And they were compromising greatly on their travel experience to take their boy along. And I was just a pill. I was not a very nice guy to take to Europe, I don't think. And they were loving me, and they were making sure I had that experience. And I looked out in that park, and it was speckled with other families, parents loving their kids just as much as my parents loved me. And it hit me right then and there. Wow, this world is home to billions of equally precious children of God. Wow, what a beautiful revelation for a little 14-year-old to have. And I've been blessed with or saddled with that observation ever since. Now when I travel, I just love this idea that we can travel as a tourist, as a traveler, and as a pilgrim. But one beautiful thing for me is when I travel, I'm never alone. I just never feel like I'm alone. Of course, we can be the tourist. We can be the tourist. I'm going to be lining up to get in that wooden shoe and get my picture taken also. That is fun. But I think it's also important to recognize that we can raise the bar a little bit. We can be travelers and we can be pilgrims. The road can be playground, the road can be school, and the road can be church or synagogue or mosque. We can learn from the road. We can see culture shock as something we want to embrace. We can see culture shock as the growing pains of a broadening perspective that just needs curation. And we can travel to learn, and we can travel to be changed. We can travel to figure out what life is all about. We can travel in a way that we get close to God. And that, I think, is traveling as a pilgrim. Now, of course, you don't need to do all or nothing, but it is fun to take advantage of the opportunity to mix it all together. And that's what I like to do, and that contributes to my worldview. We are ethnocentric. I find that people all over the world in different religions and different cultures, there's this common interest in getting close to God, understanding who made us, why are we here, what's the meaning of life, and so on. Some people do it with organized religions, other people do it with different kinds of spiritual activities, and some people do their best to ignore that. But you will find that people want to love their neighbors, and you will find that all over the world, people are ethnocentric in their immediate organized religion, but the fundamentals, to me, are global. Sure, Jesus is portrayed in different societies looking like somebody from that society, and that's just a normal kind of way to relate to a community. But the basic thing is love thy neighbor, and that's a common plank or a common value in every monotheistic religion for sure, and travel globalizes that. That's what I love about travel, is a chance to get out there. Of course, our beat is Europe, so I'm helping people find the magic in Europe. But I think more fundamental than that is to get out of our comfort zones, to get away from home, to learn a little bit about it, to hang out with people we wouldn't hang out with otherwise, and to be a little bit crazy with people we would never have a chance to be crazy with otherwise. I'll never forget the wonderful chance encounter I had with a monk in an abbey somewhere on the Italian Riviera, and he invited me into the abbey, asked me if I wanted to try some of his homemade limoncello. I said, sure. Anytime serendipity presents itself like that, you say sure. And I ended up getting a little drunk with an Italian monk, and it was a great experience, and I'm forever changed because of that. You know, Europe values that to the point where they have a well-funded government program called the Erasmus program that provides opportunities for students and teachers to work and study all over Europe. The Erasmus program. It's a beautiful, beautiful way to invest in people getting to know their neighbors. And that's one of the fundamental beauties of travel. And I think we can take that sort of openness and that lack of fear into the voting booth with us. I think when we think of the Erasmus program in Europe, we've got to remember that in Europe, there's still, I think, a healthy approach to liberal arts. And the flip side of that coin is the sadness to me that we live in a society now that is so practical and so focused on producing good, solid consumer producers that we are compromising or defunding the liberal arts and the social sciences for STEM, for science, technology, economics, and mathematics. Yeah, sure, we need to have well-trained workforce, but I just do not understand training a workforce that is not a critical thinking workforce and a workforce that can embrace the arts and be poetic. And that's a beautiful thing about travel. And that's one thing I learn when I go to Europe is they don't get excited about seeing a nude statue. They can embrace the arts, the high arts. They can have a broader perspective. I jokingly call this Florida porn because school teachers in some states in our country can lose their job if they show their students of full frontal nudity of David. I just don't understand that, and neither do my European friends. When you're traveling, you will encounter school groups in the museums with teachers teaching them about the great art of Europe and not getting all upset and concerned about nudity or thoughts that might not be comfortable for them. The arts are funded in Europe. I just love that. I mean, you go to Vienna, and of course the heritage of Vienna is to fund the arts, and you'll have lots of music that is affordable. All over Europe you find concert halls. This is the great new opera hall in Oslo. And it's just a classy hall. It's a destination piece of architecture. And it's also designed to be a people's hall. As a matter of fact, it's designed so the rooftop functions as a theater itself. And they have a concert on a floating barge there. And the whole society can gather and afford and celebrate the arts. I love a society that brings art to the people. And a wealthy society should be able to afford that. In Vienna, the opera house may be sold out, but you'll have a live stream of the opera in a huge screen outside, and the opera actually puts out chairs so people for free can enjoy the opera live on that streaming video, people who couldn't afford to get inside. We have to struggle with that in our society. Sure, we have the arts, but it's only there if philanthropists, wealthy people who can understand the value of the arts can help fund it. It's a different societal way. In Europe, you would pay for it through taxes. In the United States, you'd pay for it through charity galas and auctions and raffles and this sort of thing. I remember when we were trying to fund our orchestra in my little town, and I got a huge tax break because the president of the day wanted to give wealthy business people a tax break. And with the money I saved, just from that single tax break, it occurred to me I could pay the rent for our struggling orchestra. And I did that. And I've done that for the last decade. And it's just a reminder to me that how can an orchestra go out of business in a society as wealthy as ours, when tax breaks are going to wealthy business people, when a society could get together and fund those sort of things so everybody can have access to them. That's one reason why I'm very, very committed to helping out with public broadcasting. It's a passion of mine because it brings art, it brings critical thinking, it brings culture to the people. It makes that accessible in our society. And I think that toughens the weave of our democracy because it creates an electorate and a citizenry that is creative and critical thinking. I was just in Oslo recently, and the big new attraction on the waterfront is what's called the Smiling Bench. And you can't sit on this bench without sliding together. And it's right there in front of the Nobel Peace Prize Center, because the Nobel Peace Prize is given in Oslo. And etched into the pavement in front of that bench is a quote by Nelson Mandela. And it says, "The greatest weapon is talking to each other." And that's a beautiful thing about travel. And when we travel, we get a chance to talk to each other. Europe does a lot of that because Europe is more densely populated than we are. Europe is diverse, and Europe has challenges to live together, just like we do here in the United States. But in the United States, I think we have more of well, each society has to have a social contract. And ours is more in line with Locke's thinking, the philosopher Locke, where everybody gets a little elbow room. We had the Western movement, and just don't tread on me. And in Europe, it's more the Rousseau version of the social contract, where everybody has to give up a little more so that everybody can live well together. But when we travel, we can see how different societies are managing to live together. And I'm just really inspired by a lot of Scandinavian societies. Here we have the cathedral in Reykjavik in Iceland. And I noticed a swing set that was circular. I grew up on swing sets that were straight lines where the kids would swing parallel to each other. And this was where the kids were swinging together, and the laughter and the community and the joy that happened because of just the shape of the swing set, to me, reminded me that community is something that happens either in an organic way from the grass up or from a leadership way in a top down. But one way or another, Europe has that community. It values the piazza, the investment in the library, in the symphony, in circular swing sets. When you travel, you realize how much we have in common. I love this photograph here because this is a little girl that could have been my sister's. I could have been right on the couch next to her when I was that age. And we were bored and tired, and my parents' friends just wouldn't go home, so I was just gonna curl up in an overstuffed chair and wait for that to happen. Where is she? She could be in Mexico, she could be in Brazil, she could be in Malaysia, she could be in Morocco. She's actually in Iran. She's an Iranian girl. And in my travels, I've just had this great opportunity to see how people have so much in common. They have so much that they've grown up with together. People love gelato. I go home with a beautiful feeling that the world is filled with love, it's filled with joy, and it's filled with good people. And that's one of my favorite souvenirs. Now, these good people can be led astray. And that's something that we have to deal with today when we are understanding our responsibilities in the voting booth. And I am really into listening when history is speaking to us. History is talking to us right now. And every time I look at this photograph, it's usually when I'm giving a lecture to about that many people. And I'm looking out at an audience just like this, of good, solid local citizens. And these are good, solid local citizens in about 1930 in Munich, in Germany, listening to a charismatic, bombastic, wannabe dictator, Adolf Hitler. And it just scares me to think that half of Europe, democracies were derailed by wannabe autocrats, by dictators. Franco, Mussolini, Hitler, they knew how to put on great rallies. They knew how to capitalize on people's frustrations. They knew how to scapegoat. They knew the importance of promising, yes, we can be great. They knew how to tell a lie over and over and over so that people were numbed to it and then finally accepted it. These dictators in the 1930s knew how to demoralize respect for journalism so that there was a big question of what actually is the truth. And they led their societies astray. Of course, it's way beyond the scope of today's talk, but let me give you just a little 1-minute swing through the story of Europe in the early 20th century. After World War One, Germany was lost World War One, terrible situation, bombed out, saddled with terrible reparations, unheard of inflation, and a crackpot like Hitler had that charisma. He almost came to power, promising people there would be good times again. And he had his putsch, his beer hall putsch, an attempt to take over the country, very similar to January 6th, actually. And Hitler lost. He didn't pull off the overthrow of the government in that first uprising, and he was sent to prison. And then in the 1920s, good times came, the flappers, the cabaret era. Nobody really was complaining because everything was good. Hitler was no longer a threat. They let him out of jail. And then you had the Great Depression, 10 years after Hitler got failed with his first attempt. And with the Great Depression, all of a sudden the promises of a madman were being accepted by people who were feeling like the whole system was rigged against them. And he knew how to approach their needs. And he was elected to be the chancellor. He didn't get a full majority, but he got into the government and he just managed to finagle his way into being dictator for a day. And then he became dictator until the end of that age in Germany. And in the 1930s, he turned that society into a totalitarian society, eventually led them to war and to the downfall of Germany. This is a monument right here that is a memorial to about 80 or 90 politicians who opposed Hitler. And this is chilling. This is really chilling when I think of Donald Trump saying that if he wins, he's going to track down the people who opposed them. And I just heard him say this several times. And he'll throw them in jail, and he'll keep them there for a long time. Let me just share with you a video I was inspired to make while I was in Berlin just a few months ago. And this is just a very important monument right here. Hey, I'm Rick Steves. I'm in Berlin. I'm standing in front of the People's House here. That's the Reichstag. And Berlin is so steeped in history, and you got to be thinking of their nightmare with fascism. And Hitler was elected to their parliament. And he was part of a coalition, and his party was in the minority, but he ended up legally becoming the chancellor and then the dictator because he just wanted to be dictator for a day. And there was a handful of people in here who opposed Hitler, refused to do the proper salute, refused to kiss his ring and wear his uniform. And these are the Kinzingers, the Liz Cheneys, the Mitt Romneys, the Charles Schumers, and so on of German democracy in 1932. Well, 95 of them or something like that were arrested as soon as Hitler took power. These are the representatives and the senators of Germany that were sent to concentration camps, the first concentration camps in 1934. And what is striking to me that I just learned is most of these, generally people died after a couple of years. These people were kept alive until 1945. 1945. Hitler kept them alive, the leaders of the political opposition against him, until it was pretty clear that he was going to lose the war. And then, in 1945, these courageous politicians in Germany who stood up against fascism were murdered by that guy. Think of what can happen to a society that doesn't take the threat of autocracy seriously and doesn't value how fragile and precious democracy is. Oh my goodness. I learned so much when I travel, and I'm so thankful for that. And I bring those lessons home. Rick Steves in Berlin. Meaningful travels. Well, I don't know. It gives me chills. And a lot of people discount some of these threats. And they just say, oh, he's just talking, or he's just joking, or he's just being sarcastic. It is woe to a society that doesn't believe history can repeat. because history is trying its best to repeat. And we've got an opportunity now to learn from it and to raise our voices. That's one reason why I'm sort of calling us together to share. Again, I don't think this is Republicans against Democrats. I long for a good, principled Republican Party where we can debate, because we need to temper each other. This election is truly more fundamental than that. If you believe what the candidates are saying, it's democracy against autocracy. It's government with a constitution and government without a constitution. So to me, it's very, very important. Hey, I want to just take a quick break. I want to thank our team at Monday Night Travel. We started this at the beginning of COVID. As Gabe said, we've got like 150 episodes now banked in our archives. You can watch any of them at any time. It's a huge resource for people. If you've got any sort of specialty travel, look through our archive and see all the great, great hours that we've brought your way. I enjoy looking at lots of them when I'm going someplace, because there's so many experts that have joined us over the last couple of years. Our team is Emily, it's Ben, it's Lisa, it's Gabe, and this group is so passionate about this work, and we're just thankful that you join us each Monday. And we've got a lot of great travels coming up, I can promise you that. And I get to drop in every month or so. So that's nice. I'd love to share what I've been up to. By the way, I'll be in the theme of the whole fascism and everything. I'll be sharing my 1-hour special on fascism on October 21st. And I hope that you can join us. This has been a surprise hit all over the United States because it is so pertinent. And it was one of the greatest writing challenges of my life as a TV producer and a travel writer. If you'd like to join us, put that on your calendar. Monday Night Travel, it's fascism. I'll be streaming it with you or screening it with you and giving you a behind-the-scenes sort of commentary on it and what we learned from it. And again, that's October 21st. All right. Hey, also, Gabe and Ben will be mailing out a email tomorrow with all the links that we have for more information, but they're also there in the chat section. We have a link to how to sign up to vote, or to be sure that you are registered to vote. We have a link for voting from abroad. It's so important, if you have a loved one or you are living abroad, that you recognize you need as your citizen's duty to vote, if you believe in that, and it's very straightforward. We've got a link called votefromabroad.org, and you can go there and make sure that you're all set up. It's very easy, and then you can participate in this coming election. Also, we've got on a link to this book, and again, this is on sale for half price. It's $10 tonight instead of $20 on our website. Also, we'll be going to Ethiopia and Guatemala in a few minutes. I wrote a booklet. It's a small book, but it's a wonderful book that explains the economics of hunger and how there can be hunger in a world with such affluence. And this is available in a PDF format for free on our website. You'll have a link to that. And also you can watch that show, Rick Steves' Hunger and Hope, Lessons Learned in Ethiopia and Guatemala. Also, there's a link to a journal I wrote back actually in 1988 when I was just politicized by my first trip to El Salvador and Nicaragua back during the Contra and the Sandinista days. And the theme of my journal was There's Blood on Your Banana. And it was quite an experience for me, a transformational experience. And that journal is vivid. It takes you right into the trenches of what was going on back then. And you've got a link to it there. And it was written from my experience back then in that amazing time. All right. Hey, let's carry on right now. And we're going to go back to Berlin. And of course, I mentioned, Hitler brought Germany into World War II. Sadly, just before the end of World War II, all of the politicians that opposed Hitler were killed after he kept many of them in solitary confinement for many years. And then as he saw that the war was about to be lost, he said, let's kill all those guys. What an evil man. Well, then Germany was united, and that building there, the Parliament building, was on no man's land, where the Berlin Wall was. And the last days of World War II were fought on the rooftop of that building, Russians against German Nazis. And it's sad, a burned out, bombed out Hulk until the end of the Cold War and the falling apart of the Soviet Union, the fall of the wall. And then suddenly the split country of Germany was united. The government goes from Bonn back to Berlin, and Berlin, in good style, doesn't bulldoze the bombed out old historical parliament building. It renovates it, and it puts onto the top a beautiful glass dome. I was there on opening day of that glass dome, and I walked that spiral staircase up to the top. It's so powerful to be up there, and it's designed so you literally look down over the shoulders of your legislators on the ground floor, and those German citizens could symbolically keep an eye on their legislators, those people who had let them down so terribly in previous years. And I was on top of that dome, as I mentioned, on opening day, surrounded by teary-eyed Germans. Now, anytime you're surrounded by teary-eyed Germans, something exceptional is going on. What was going on here? This was the emotional, dramatic, symbolic closing of a difficult chapter in the history of a great nation. No more division, no more communism, no more war. A united country with a new parliament building looking into a promising future. And many of these teary eyes were old enough to remember Berlin when it was just a pile of bricks in 1945 after World War II. I was up there. I got to witness that. I was covered with goosebumps. I'm covered with goosebumps talking about it right now. What a day. What a day for Germany. And I looked at the other American tourists up there, and they were unmoved. They didn't get it. They were distracted. Where can I get a Coke? Why don't they air condition this place? My battery's running low. And I was sad. I thought, oh God, am I living in a dumbed down society? Is that the level of curiosity and interest and thoughtfulness of the modern American traveler? And in some ways, yes. There are powerful forces in our society that would find it convenient, more profitable if we were all just dumbed down. And I vowed then and there as a travel writer running my own little business that I'm going to expect my clientele, my travelers, to be smartened up, not dumbed down. Yes, you make more money off of people when you dumb them down, but I don't want to make money off of a dumbed down society. I want to inspire my neighbors, my customers, my workmates to be engaged, to be involved, to be curious, to be learning, to be contributing. That's what makes the weave of a society strong. And I think there are huge swaths of our society that are taking their eyes off the prize. They're being dumbed down in the interest of making more money. We've got to expect our neighbors to be smartened up and not dumbed down. We've got to have a government that wants us to be smart, not dumbed down, that funds education, that recognizes we don't want an electorate that's malleable, that's easy to con. We want an electorate that's not easy to be conned, that respects the complexity of things and doesn't want a bumper sticker answer. Germany paid a huge price for not having a thoughtful electorate. They had a bamboozled electorate. And today, you feel in Germany an appreciation of their government that we need to invest in education as a matter of national security. Sometimes I get a sense that a smart electorate threatens certain parts of our society. I want an electorate that threatens certain parts of our society because they're well educated. Education is national security. We don't want to live in a dumbed down society, even if it's more profitable. There is a lesson you learn by leaving your home and looking at it from a distance. Now, I have such a great respect for our foreign service. I have such a great respect for public servants who have dedicated their careers to helping our society work. It's a complicated world. This is Eric Ramanathan. He is the American ambassador to Sweden, living in Stockholm. And I was invited to his mansion for a party when I was in town just last summer. And over the years, I've been to many ambassadors' homes around Europe. And I am so inspired by ambassadors who are passionate and ambassadors who are committed to helping our country work better with the family of nations. And to me, it's a huge thing to have a non-political foreign service. And sometimes when a new president comes in, all of these experts that know the language, know the culture, are beloved by the locals, are tossed out, and somebody is tossed in there that doesn't even speak the local language, that doesn't like the local food, that could care less to learn anything about where they are. That happens. During Trump's presidency, The ambassador in Berlin was famously ugly American. He could care less about Germany. He didn't speak a word of German. He'd take people to American restaurants when they came to Berlin and never tried the German cuisine. It's embarrassing, it's insulting, and it's not good for our society. If the Republicans win this next election, they target the deep state as if it's an evil thing. The institutions of our society are held together by committed, non-political public servants. They need to be smart. They need some institutional history. They need some continuity. They need to work together. They need to believe in the mission of their organization, even if it's not convenient for some opportunistic politician. If the Republicans win, tens of thousands of these committed public servants are going to be fired, and they're going to be replaced by apparatchiks, by ideologues, by cronies, by people who don't believe in what that department is supposed to do. It's the institutions of a society that hold it together, that save it from being derailed. And the societies that respect their institutions, that trust their institutions, I think are the societies that are the most successful, with the most content and thankful populace. That's what Scandinavia has over other countries. They trust their institutions. They have faith in their institutions. They expect their institutions to be good and non-political, and they are. So when we vote, we've got to understand there's deep roots in how our institutions are held together and how the United States interfaces with the rest of the world. That's all going to be ripped out, and ideologues will be put in their place. And that does not bode well for America, regardless of your political party, because the world's a complicated place. And I've been so inspired by the ambassadors that I call friends all over Europe. And we need people of that caliber. Democrats or Republicans, I don't really care. We need people who know the terrain and people who deserve to be in the driver's seat as our country learns and works to work well with the family of nations. The world needs the United States at the table. Let me give you a little illustration where I picked that up. I was filming in France a few years ago, and the sun was going down. We're coming into this little village. I wanted to get up to, we were friends with these aristocratic couple that runs this chateau, Rochepot it's called. We got there, and the sun was going down, and I just, oh, hello, bonjour, bonjour. And they wanted to give us a wine and so on. I said, no, I have to get up on the roof first because the sun's going down and we're filming. No, 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 we must have a glass of wine. Okay, so we put the camera down and we paused and we tried to relax. And of course, we had the glass of wine, but the family brought out this flag you're looking at here, the 48-star American flag. And they told us this is the American flag that we hoisted over our town on that day in 1944 when we were freed from Nazi tyranny by American troops. Wow. That is such a beautiful experience. And they told us we will never let Americans into our castle without bringing out our flag and thanking those Americans for the courage, the strength, the valor, the commitment to freedom of the American troops that saved us. And we would ask you to go home and tell your neighbors and your friends that in France we are forever thankful for America for freeing us from the Nazis. This is from a society where if you meet people that are a few years older than me, if you meet people in their mid-70s, many of them are named Frankie and Johnny. What's going on with that? Named after American GIs in the late 1940s that the parents knew and were inspired by. What a beautiful thing that we have that connection with Europe. You know, we had 4 years without America at the table. We had 4 years of isolationism, 4 years of threatening to get out of NATO, 4 years where we really had nothing to do with the family of nations, where everything was transactional. America needs better than that for our own security and for the good of the world. And I want to remind you, the ideals of America are bigger than any single administration. The ideals of America shine in an inspirational way on the hilltop. to nations, to wannabe democracies all over this planet. It's a beautiful thing. And things don't happen without the United States taking part. If there's a multinational effort to do something, maybe they'll happen, but it happens much easier and much more effectively and much stronger if the United States is at the table. Europe can complain about this and we can bicker about this and that, but deep down, we're all on the same team, and the world needs and the world wants the United States at the table when it comes to dealing with the challenges that will be confronting us in the near future. I hope we can take that understanding into the voting booth with us, because the difference between the two parties is stark in this way. What's the caliber of the people that will be representing the United States to the rest of the world? And what's the attitude from the White House of where the United States belongs? Bridges or walls? Bridges or walls? You can build walls and try to be safe behind those walls, but the problems of the future will be oblivious to walls. They'll float right over the walls. They'll be immune to weaponry. The problems that confront us in the future are going to require good governance. They're going to require technology. They're going to require nations working together. Because in the future, it's not going to be win-lose. When there's a COVID-type challenge hitting us, it's got to be win-win or it's lose-lose. And we can do that if we're part of the family of nations and if we provide American leadership like the world needs. And that's one reason why I'm going to vote with gusto, with enthusiasm, for somebody that believes in working together with other nations. Now, a lot of Americans are going to look at the Europeans and say, oh, they're just a bunch of communists or Marxists, you know. That's baloney. Europeans are as capitalistic as we are. They just see government as a necessary referee to provide parameters for capitalism so that it is sustainable and so that their society has an element of equity and justness in it. I love the way Europe works, and I love the way Europe has chosen not to produce as much as we do. Yes, we make more than Europe does. We probably make 20 or 30% more than what Europe makes per person. And it's not because our system's better, it's because Europe chooses to work 20 or 30% less. By any measure, the Western European worker produces about what we do per hour. They choose to work less hours and have less stuff so they can have a better work-life balance. It's not right or wrong, it's just a European choice. I was raised with the American work ethic. I didn't have a choice, it was the work ethic. Well, it just occurred to me a few years ago, there's more than one work ethic. My Norwegian relatives have a different work ethic than I do. My Spanish friends certainly have a different work ethic than I do. These guys have a different work ethic than I do, and they do it by choice. I was in Amsterdam one day wandering around doing my research, and I met these guys. They're not students, these are grown adults. And it's Wednesday afternoon. What are you guys doing in this boat? I was thinking. Well, they said, it's Wednesday. We get together with our mates and have a party. Do you want to get in the boat? No, I'm working. Europeans know how to work and they know how to play. And again, it's not right or wrong. It's just an option that societies have. We Americans have the shortest vacations in the rich world. And that is nothing to be proud of. I want to remind you that you'll see a lot of demonstrations in Europe these days because Europe is an aging society. And it's a very interesting sort of thing. Europe's welfare society, all of the perks that you get for their high taxes and their big social services and so on, is based on a pyramid demographic situation with a lot of young people working and paying taxes and then older people not living that long. The result of a well-educated and prosperous society, which is a successful society like the United States or Europe, is people have fewer kids and they live longer. When you have fewer kids and you work long and you live longer, that pyramid of a demographic makeup becomes like this. You have fewer people working, more people living to retirement, and then live way too long after that, and the few people working cannot support all of the people living past retirement. In the old days, with a lot of people working and kicking into the system and people not living so long, it was easy to do. So now politicians have to explain to their populace the arithmetic that we just cannot give you what we gave you before because there's not enough of you working to kick into the system. And rank and file in Europe doesn't like that. They don't want to be told you can't retire when you're this age, you got to work 4 more years. So they demonstrate. When you see these demonstrates in Europe, and a lot of times they are because of this adjustment, because of the demographic change, which is the consequence of a successful society. It's interesting to see Europe struggling with the same thing as we are and how they will be dealing with it. It's fascinating to me how Europe and the United States have similar problems, similar challenges. Drug problem, that's a situation both societies have struggled with. I was originally inspired by Europe's approach to marijuana, that it should be, rather than legislating morality and just saying no, it should be pragmatic harm reduction. And I led the charge to help legalize marijuana back when Washington State and Colorado were the first ones to do it. One of the reasons Europe legalized marijuana was so that it could deal with its opioid problems more effectively. And this is a whole long story that you can learn about outside of this particular talk. But I was just looking at the statistics, and it is amazing. In the United States, we're losing every year more people than we lost in the entire Vietnam War to opioid-related overdose deaths. 80,000 people in a typical year die because of opioid overdoses and so on. In Europe, similar drug-related deaths would be 2,000 a year in Germany, and in Portugal, only 60 people a year. Every society has a different approach to this problem, and it's a problem that is just ravishing the United States. What is the deal? In Europe, they don't legislate morality. They have pragmatic harm reduction. In Portugal, the word for, if I understand it correctly, the word for addicted is not addicted, but it is enslaved. People are enslaved to drugs. Addiction sort of implies that they're criminals and they need to have legal help and they need to go to jail and all this kind of stuff. And if somebody is enslaved to drugs, it means they need help. They need a helping hand. They need nurses. They need counseling. It's an educational and a health challenge. Well, that approach, that compassionate approach, works. And in Portugal, they lose almost nobody to opioid overdose deaths because they were the most liberal society in Europe when it comes to drug policy reform. These are examples of how we can learn from Europe. These are examples of how we can be pragmatic harm reduction in our focus rather than legislating morality. It is folly to legislate morality. Another thing I've picked up in my travels is everybody has their own challenges. I just think it's fascinating. How we might think we have the unique sort of challenge, and then you travel around the world and you see other people have it too. As I often like to say when I'm giving some of my talks, great experience I had in Eastern Turkey, tooling around in Eastern Turkey looking for something to do with a tour bus, and we found in the shadow of Mount Ararat a high school stadium filled with students having some kind of a pep rally. We parked the bus, we went in, and all these students are thrusting their fist up in the air and singing together, "We are a secular nation, we are a secular nation." I asked my Turkish guide, "What's going wrong? Don't they like God here?" And she said, "Oh, we love God, but considering the rising tide of Islamic fundamentalism just over the border to our east in Iran, we're having a pep rally for pluralism to protect the fragile and precious separation of mosque and state in our society." Wow, a pep rally for pluralism with a bunch of high school Turks in the shadow of Mount Ararat in the far east of Turkey. Who'd have thunk? And that's just a reminder that there are complicated and important issues being struggled with in societies all over the world. And when we travel, we can gain an empathy for these, and we can gain an empathy for people's baggage and their worldview and the challenges they have that are unique to them. I was just in Morocco a couple of months ago, and I was fascinated by this modern Islamic society's approval of King Mohammed VI. And I asked my Moroccan friends, is there no movement for a democracy? You're putting up with this king and it just seems so out of date. And they said, well, we don't want to be another Syria. And they were tuned into the tragedy of Syria that tried to overthrow their king, and it's just ripped that society to threads. And they are being pragmatic about it's not quite the right time to push for democracy in their society. I'm fascinated by this notion that different societies are all on parallel educational tracks, parallel evolutionary tracks. And some societies have had their revolution. They've had their reformation. They've had their civil rights movement. They've had their women's rights movement. They've had their Vatican II. And other societies are behind. And I just think we need to remember that each society is at a different place on that evolutionary track. Hopefully they're all going forward toward the values that we find universal. But we Americans have to be a little bit patient sometimes and pragmatic, as different societies have to choose according to where they are on that racetrack towards modernity. I've learned a lot of lessons in my travels that put me in my place when it comes to being ethnocentric. We are not the norm. I learned that for my first time, or one of my most memorable times anyways, in Afghanistan. As a kid, I was backpacking through Afghanistan. I was in the cafeteria in Kabul where all the backpackers go for lunch. And a man joined me. He said, "Can I join you?" I said, "You already have." He said, "Are you an American?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I'm a professor here in Afghanistan, and I want you to know that a third of the people in this society eat with their spoon and fork like you do. A third of the people in this world eat with chopsticks. And a third of the people eat with fingers like I do, and we're all civilized just the same. We're all civilized just the same." That stuck with me. This guy had a chip on his shoulder. He thought the Americans going through there thought less of him because he ate with his fingers. And he was right, I did. And I thought, I'm going to go the rest of this trip and eat with my fingers, like the locals. And it was a beautiful experience. Beautiful experience. I had to actually be trained when I got home to use a spoon and fork again. It's so important to realize that we're not the norm. People who sit on a toilet are not the norm. We are so unusual in our ability to think that we are exceptional in God's eyes. I think the only thing exceptional about us in God's eyes is our ability to think that we're exceptional. We're all struggling to figure it out, and different societies have different cultures and different answers. And when we travel, it humbles us, it connects us, and I think it makes us wiser. We have to be curious in our travels. You have a choice to make. You're going to go down to Mexico, or you're going to go to, in Latin America, are you going to go to Mazatlan, or are you going to go to Managua? Well, of course, you're going to go to Mazatlan. That's the comfortable place to go. But you have a choice. You can learn by going where American school buses go. Instead of dying, they go south of the border, and they go to towns where they serve as public buses. You can learn about the impact of American trade policy on Central America. It's a fascinating sort of thing, but I want to warn you, Thomas Jefferson said, travel makes a person wiser, if less happy. It can be a burden to be exposed to what I call bananaology. I mentioned earlier that I was politicized by my trips down to Central America back in the 1980s during the Sandinista and the Contra times. And I wrote a journal about it, which is, it's kind of a rough journal. It's way back when I was a kid. But the journal is available on our website. And you can go to ricksteves.com and you can search for bananaology. And you can find it, and you might find it interesting reading. I'd love to talk about it now. I don't have time, but I do want to remind you that the most powerful travel experiences I've had in my life are when I've gone places where my government says I can't go there. It's really good to get to know the enemy. If my government says I can't go someplace, that's the first place I want to go. Cuba, Palestine, Iran. I wouldn't do it when it's dangerous. I wouldn't go to Iran now, for example. But I've been to all these countries when the conventional wisdom in the United States was you don't go there. Of course, other countries, we're going there all the time. The number one Caribbean destination for Canadians and Germans is Cuba, when Americans thought nobody can go to Cuba. A big selling book for Lonely Planet in normal times is Iran. And we had a great time traveling in Iran when we made our TV show. If you get a chance, don't be reckless. Don't do anything foolhardy, but consider going places that are not the norm. When I went to Iran, it was a rich experience. Oh my goodness, fascinating experience. You can watch the whole show on Iran. But talk about a powerful experience. Tehran's a city of 10, 12 million people, something like that. Walking under that propaganda poster there, 8-story tall American flag, stripes made with dropping bombs, stars made with skulls, down with the USA. Walking underneath that hateful propaganda as an American on the streets of Tehran, awkward. But then I reminded myself, all the people around me None of them were born when that was made. The propaganda is older than the people. They don't live in a free society. They live in a theocracy where they get in trouble if they raise their voices. So they just got to keep their head down and live with that hateful propaganda. I was in a traffic jam that day. There are a lot of traffic jams in Tehran. Our car was just stopped in the middle of the traffic. And then the man in the next car went like this to the driver, rolled down your window and handed over a bouquet of flowers and said, "Give this to the foreigner in your back seat and apologize for our traffic." My preconceptions about Iran were just being really messed up here. I don't know about where you live, but where I live, nobody does that in a traffic jam. Later on, we were in another traffic jam. It was just silent. We're sitting there, and suddenly my driver bursts out. He goes, "Death to traffic." Death to traffic? I thought it was death to Israel or death to America, I told him. He said, "No, right now it's death to traffic." And I said, "Well, what is that about you Iranians saying death to everything?" This is my driver. He doesn't speak English very well. He's just a friend of mine, and we were talking in broken English, and he was trying to explain it to me. He said, "Well, here in Iran, when something is frustrating to us and out of our control, we say death to that." And I thought, well, what's that mean? That means damn. When he says damn the traffic, he translates it in a crude way, death to traffic. Not that crude, actually, because that's what damn means, death too. I thought, if I ever said damn somebody, if I ever said damn those teenagers, well, sure I have. Do I really want them to burn in hell and for an eternity and die? No, of course not. It's just after midnight. Turn down the music. Damn those teenagers. Death to teenagers. It's just an example of how when you travel, you realize the world is more complicated than a bumper sticker. We've got to understand the nuance, the context, the baggage that people have. The baggage. That's what we did with our time in Iran. We humanized 70 million Iranian people, and we realized how a guy like Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollah could be in power. It's a fascinating and a rich society to experience, and it's a society with baggage. Think about the baggage 9/11 gives Americans, and that's every country's got baggage at least as bad as 9/11. Not to minimize our baggage. It was a horrible thing. 3,000 people died 24 years ago. And it was tragic. And we were hit. And we couldn't just sit there and be hit. We had to hit back. Well, other societies have the same baggage. Iran-Iraq war, back in the 1980s, over 1 million casualties. The carnage on the Western Front of Iran was a lot like the carnage between France and Germany in World War I on the Western Front. That's baggage. And when we were there filming, we went to what's called martyrs' cemeteries. Every town had a martyrs' cemetery, wailing with grief, decades after the war was over. And if you look at this woman, who every Friday sits on the tomb of her loved one, her father, her husband, her son, I don't know, but she comes there every Friday, filled with grief. And what's going on in her mind? They were invaded by Saddam Hussein, funded by the United States of America, and her husband died. This is powerful baggage. And we need to understand that we expect people to give us a little wiggle room because of our baggage. We need to give other people a little wiggle room because of their baggage. After 9/11, we Americans did things that we are not normally doing. That wasn't really who we are. But we felt justified because of how we had been hit. We do need to understand that other societies have their baggage too. On the last day of our work, a woman came up to me and she said, "Are you an American journalist?" I said, "Yes." And she said, doing this with her finger on my chest, "I want you to go home and tell the truth. We're strong, we're united, and we just don't want our little girls to be raised like Britney Spears." And it occurred to me right then and there, these are the little nuggets you get as a travel writer. We don't want our girls to be raised like Britney Spears. What motivated this base? How did 51% of Iran vote for the guys that seem so loopy who were running that country back then? Holocaust deniers. Just people that had the most wacko viewpoints. How did they get into power? Who elected them? Who was their base? Their base was the small town, less educated fundamentalists. That's it. Small town, less educated fundamentalists. Good people, don't get me wrong, good people motivated by fear and love. And they just didn't want their little girls to become boy toys, crass materialists, and drug addicts. Just don't want my little girl to become Britney Spears. That is an incursion from the West. What a country like Iran is afraid of is incursions from the West. They grew up with the Shah, an incursion from the West, who was the opposite of any ethical, moral, Iranian, Muslim person. Oh my goodness, the Shah. When the Shah was in power in Tehran, they were bragging the miniskirts are shorter in Tehran than they are in Paris. He was a cosmopolitan elite, put there by the United States so we could have access to their oil. We need to understand the complexity of these stories because that's the base. Those are the people that elect that country that causes us so much trouble now. And what motivates them? Fear and love, not the price of oil. They just don't want their kids to be hijacked by our values that they don't agree with. We could be just as adamant about protecting our kids from being hijacked with somebody else's values. Think about the fear. Think about the love. Think about the value of travel to learn about this. Now, when I look at these girls, I am so thankful I've been to Iran because I look at those little girls and I see promise. I see joy. I see opportunity. I see a reason for us to try to sort out our differences and let the world live in a way where we're not afraid of each other. Live in a way where we're building bridges instead of walls. Every one of those little girls is just as spunky and feisty as my little girl and her schoolmates back when they were that age. And I'm thankful for that. Through my travels, I'm less afraid. I'm more connected. And I take that into the voting booth. There are a lot of walls on this planet. Physical walls and metaphorical walls. And these walls divide people. We've got metaphorical walls in our society that are just as tall and ugly as that one. And of course, this is a wall that divides the Israeli and the Palestinian people. You don't know what a wall is until you've talked to people on both sides of that wall. Metaphorical walls in our country, just like concrete walls in the Holy Land. Every wall has two sides. Every wall has two stories. Go to the Holy Land. Talk to Jewish people. Talk to settlers. We talk to a lot of settlers camping out in the West Bank. Talk to Palestinians. How many people go to the Holy Land, talk to Jews, and come home and know the story? If you can't talk to Palestinians also, you don't know the story. And think of the power of media in our society and how media is controlled. It's tough to get the story if you're docile. If you're a voter who cares, you've got to reach out. There's 7 million Palestinians in the Holy Land, and there are 7 million Jews in the Holy Land. You can't just wish that away. Israel is confronted with a very serious challenge. Some of our politicians want a two-state solution. Some of our politicians are satisfied with a one-state solution. Let me just sum it up really quickly. It's complicated and I know it's a little wonky. But if you're thinking about what's good for Israel, as I am, because I care about Israel, and I feel like my stance on Israel is because it's what's good for Israel, because I value Israel, and I really am thankful there's a safe, secure Jewish state on this planet. If you're Israel, you can be a one-state solution or a two-state solution to the Palestinian issue. One state or two states. If it's two states, each state needs to be guaranteed safety, security, and the dignity of being truly independent. If it's one state, it's either going to be the way it is today, or it's going to be a pluralistic modern democracy. And if it's a pluralistic modern democracy, in one generation there'll be no more Jewish state because Palestinians would have a much faster growth in their population, and they would just overwhelm the Jews in the voting booth, and it would be a Palestinian-dominated state if it's one state. Israel doesn't want that. I don't blame them. So the alternative for Israel is the status quo, which is with a very difficult situation where you've got half of your population essentially caged, or a two-state solution where everybody has the opportunity to have dignity and security and freedom. It's a very tough, complicated issue. But the United States is there at the table. We're the primary funder of it. And we care. And we need smart government. Boy, we need a thoughtful government to help sort this out. And I think there is a huge difference in the sophistication of coming at this challenge between the two candidates running for president. I want to talk about a couple more things, and I realize I'm going about 10 minutes too long, but I do want to cover climate change because we are travelers and we contribute to climate change. Our environment is fragile and we travel to enjoy it. When you go to Europe, and that's my beat, you see climate change is there. You go to Vernazza and the Cinque Terre. One day it's a beautiful, thriving town, and the next day you've got a flash flood. And there are floods all over Europe now that inundate towns with mud. This city was uninhabitable for about a year. It's been rebuilt, but it'll never be the same. Victim of climate change. I was in Alexandria a couple of years ago, so charmed by their harbor front. Look at this beautiful promenade in Egypt on the Mediterranean. And then on my way to the airport, I looked out the window and I saw the construction blocks and what they have to do, like they're doing on beautiful promenades from Havana to Alexandria and beyond, is bolstering that in anticipation of higher water levels. I was just in Hamburg 2 months ago. Hamburg has a new levee, much taller than the old levee, very expensive, landscaped, it's pretty, it's kind of people-oriented, but it's just a very expensive barrier against a rising tide. I was just barging in Burgundy. I'm just showing you a few random examples of climate change. But you find these mammoth riverboats tied up, and their travelers are sightseeing by tour bus now. All over Europe, the riverboats can't go where they promise they want to go because of droughts, and they can't get their boat on the rivers because the water is too low. On the canals, I was just on the canals. We couldn't go on some canals because they've been blocked up by invasive weeds that never were there before because now the climate's different and these weeds grow there. And it's just another one of the examples. I was just at a vintner on the most precious, expensive, beautiful vineyard slopes in all of Europe. And they're looking at the top of the hill and they're going to cut down those trees so they can migrate up higher because of the brutal heat of climate, of heat waves. It's driving them uphill. This is an existential problem for vintners in Europe. I was just in South England, and towns that for centuries never needed a water gate now have a barrier to keep the salt water from inundating their town when you have a high tide. I was just in the Netherlands, and they're moving tons and tons of mud to bolster their dikes. I was just in Rotterdam. Can you imagine putting 2 Eiffel Towers down on their side with wheels and opening and closing to protect 1 million people when you have a storm surge? A storm surge barrier the size of 2 Eiffel Towers. Amazing. Government makes a difference when it comes to fighting climate change. It is a stark difference that we're going to be voting for in November. Do you want a government that believes in climate change, or do you want a government that decides to ignore climate change? Do you want a government that's motivated by the short-term profit statements of its donors, its class, its corporate leaders? In other words, ignore climate change and let the next generation pay for it because we want to make our money now? Or do you want a government that is honest about climate change and will invest the money now so that our children and their children don't have to pay for our greed? It's black and white. It's ethical and it's unethical. It's truth and lies. We need government leadership to do something about climate change, or when the people making the decisions now are long gone, the rest of our community is going to pay for it. It couldn't be any more simple. You know what I'm talking about. Climate change or no climate change, Democrat or Republican. This is in Nice here. This used to be a congested traffic street, and now it's a green belt with a bike path, with pedestrian paths, and with shiny lines where the tram comes by every 2 minutes. This was a busy car-filled street in Amsterdam a few years ago. Today, bike lanes, pedestrian paths, tram lines, and the sound of birds. Amsterdam is well on the way to being free from fossil fuels. This is Copenhagen, a city where I never go anywhere without a bicycle. Every year now in Europe, there's more cities where I just get a bike and keep it for my whole stay. Hamburg, Paris, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Munich, Berlin, you name it, bicycles are hip. This is a hub where you've got the subway, you got the buses, and you've got the bike racks. And the bikes, my local guide told me it's indented. It's like 2 feet lower than street level, so the bikes kind of disappear from your view line. And you look around and you realize there's a lot of airiness here because there's no cars parked. There's 1,000 bikes within view here. And they're a little bit down below so you don't see them. And everybody's got their bike, everybody's got their government subsidized public transit, and they get around just fine, and it is totally green. We could do that in the United States. We could do that. This is the new rental bike program in Oslo. I didn't go anywhere in Oslo without a bike. It was wonderful. In Paris, I was just there last month. What used to be a busy arterial along the Seine River, now it's the Paris Plage, the beach of Paris. People driving cars don't like it, but everybody else does. It's a new age in Europe. This is Berlin. And this is, German told me, we Germans love our charts. And he pointed out the chart and all of the plans because they're making this street very inconvenient for drivers and very convenient for people who live there with bicycles, with transit passes, and with walking shoes. I just love that. In Oslo now, 80% of the cars purchased are electric cars. The entire fleet of ferries on the Oslo fjord is electronic. It's like a bunch of floating Teslas. I was just touring the fjords, the islands of Oslo on my last visit. And when the ferry came in, this thing that looks like that black whale's tail, that's a charging unit. It comes down, it plugs in, and the ferry charges as the people are getting off and on, and then the ferry takes off again, and it is totally green. Europe is doing some great stuff. What are we doing as travelers? We're not going to be flight shamed out of our travels, but we understand that we are contributing to climate change with the carbon that we create when we fly to Europe. And I know scientists have taught us that it takes $30 well invested to mitigate the carbon you create when you fly to Europe and back. $30. It is unethical for me to take 30,000 people to Europe on my Rick Steves tours every year without paying for their carbon. It should be a cost of goods sold that is billed to me by the government, I wish, in some kind of a carbon tax, but we don't do it that way in the United States because taxes are not good for business in the short term. They're good for long-term sustainability, perhaps. So what I do, just as an ethical tour operator, is we pay for the carbon with a self-imposed carbon tax. $30 per person times $30, rounded up. It's a $1 million investment every year to a portfolio of 10 organizations that are helping farmers in the developing world do their farming while contributing less to climate change. And that clearly mitigates the carbon we create while helping farmers in the developing world, and we're able to tell our travelers they are traveling carbon-free. I'm very proud of this program. I don't want to brag about it because there's nothing to brag about. It's just baseline ethics. Every tour company should do that. In fact, if you find that program on our website, the first thing it says right at the top of the program is, if you're a tour operator, steal this program for us, don't credit us, and use it in your tour program, because we've all got to start paying for our carbon. And we have to travel in a way where we use less carbon or emit less carbon, and we have to travel in a way where we become better, more enthusiastic citizens of the planet and tuned into the needs of the planet. And then I think it is ethical to travel. We need to understand that how we vote is huge for this issue. It is black and white. The last thing I want to talk about is economics. There's a huge gap in our society between rich people and poor people, and there's a growing gap between rich countries and poor countries as the economy rolls on. We had a fascinating opportunity to do a show, a 1-hour program called Hunger and Hope. And I want to remind you, there's the book that I wrote on that experience is available for free in its PDF form on our website. You'll get the link. But we're travelers. We're privileged people. We eat a lot. We have wonderful hotels. We spend a lot of money on airplanes. We work hard. We got a winning system. We're privileged. But that doesn't get us off the hook when it comes to being mindful of the fact that half of the world is trying to live on $5 a day. That is the income of half of the world. The average person on this planet is a smallholder farmer trying to feed their family on $5 a day. That's okay. That's tough, but I think that's livable and that's the basis for progress. What I don't accept is extreme poverty. And that's what the United Nations lists as $2 a day. If you're trying to live on $2 a day, you're in extreme poverty. That is 10% of humanity. I've worked on this a lot in the last couple of decades, and I know that in one generation, we cut hunger dramatically in more than half. It was really on a trajectory to beat hunger. And in the last decade, because of COVID, because of conflict, because of climate change, and because of corruption, that it is a hockey stick. We had this trajectory, and then the hockey stick goes up. I don't like that kind of graph when it comes to hunger on this planet, and that little tick up is disturbing. But we can still stay focused on the prize, and we can tackle extreme hunger. And my case is, it is loving your neighbor. It's the ethical thing to do, especially when you're as affluent, privileged as we are, to tackle generously and smartly extreme poverty on this planet. But it's also, even in the privacy of the voting booth, you don't care about love your neighbor. It's a practical investment for a stable world for you and your kids. And that's a twofer. It's the right thing to do, and it's a good, selfish investment at the same time. If you're trying to live on $2 a day, you have no chimney, you have a fire on the floor, a dirt floor, a mud brick home, and you walk for water, you have no electricity, no education, very little access to health care. That is hopeless. That's what we can target. And when you have a chance to see extreme poverty, it rips you apart. And you wonder, how can this be? The average lot in life for women on this planet is to walk for water and to walk for firewood. This woman is nowhere near as old as she looks. Her life is very difficult. She abandons her children every morning to walk for water and walk for firewood. That is not unusual. That's the norm for women on this planet in much of the global South. We can do something about that. We can do something about that. And with modern aid, developmental aid, that empowers local people in smart ways, it's a long story, but that's what we talk about in this program, and that's what we talk about with this book, if you'd like to check it out. We can help the next generation of people in this part of the world be well-educated and healthy. Well-educated and healthy. With one water faucet, there can be hygiene. And when there's hygiene, there's better health. And when there's running water, moms can stay home with their kids and nurture them instead of leaving them to walk for life-sustaining water. It's fascinating. I was down in Guatemala being inspired by what was going on, how things were getting traction. And then the headline was, Donald Trump stops $500 million in development aid. And I was with the peasants, I was with the farmers when this headline came out. It was heartbreaking to be so inspired by their hard work and realizing it was happening because of smart development aid by the United States north of the border. And then the man who wants to build a wall and is so mad at everybody for trying to get into our country cuts them off. And all of that work had to be interrupted because there's no more money for it. I know what that's like. Every year we give $1 million to 10 organizations that do this kind of work. During COVID, we didn't have any people going to Europe. We couldn't, 30 times 0 is 0. That's all we owed according to our formula. I didn't have the heart to stop sending them money, knowing what they've been doing with that money. So, we kept doing it. If you knew, Jackson, I'm just talking about hunger here. If you knew the impact of this smart, modern development aid, you would know the tragedy of short-sighted leadership on behalf of the United States. We can afford this, and we don't afford it because we love our neighbor. Of course, we love our neighbor, most of us do, but let's just assume in the privacy of the voting booth we don't. We do it because it's a good investment for stability. It's a way to help these people do what they want to do. They want to work hard and sell things. They want to stay on their land. They don't want to go to the big city and be homeless, and they certainly don't want to climb over a fence and come into the United States. They want to stay home. We can help them stay home. I'm getting a little emotional about this because this is an issue on our election right now. President Trump would line out all development aid. If he had his wish, he'd cut it all to 0 because we got to help our people before we help the people south of the border. I'm making a case that it is the right thing to do, and it is a pragmatic, effective investment in stability if we continue developing aid, modern developmental aid. It's not your grandmother's aid anymore. This is good, smart aid. And that's a whole different lecture. But we need to do that. We need to recognize the impact of climate change on these societies, on these farmers. These hardworking farmers, they're throwing a curve. They're just getting it together, and all of a sudden the climate's acting up weird. Well, we've got smart technology. We've got climate smart seeds. We've got climate smart livestock. We've got climate smart technologies that empower people south of the border to be productive, to stay at home and to work the land. That makes our world a more stable place, a more just place, and America can take leadership in that. And that's one reason I'm so concerned about this election, to be honest with you. A lot of people, it's trendy or it's kind of cool to not like the United Nations. I've seen the United Nations in action all over the world. And I love the United Nations. The United Nations comes in and you can feel the joy. Mothers come out of the woodwork with their babies to learn how to help them with their nutrition and how to keep their kids vaccinated and how to make sure that they're not stunted, recognizing the importance of good nutrition, not just calories, but good calories for the first 1,000 days of that child's existence, including the days prenatal and then after they're a couple of years old. The value of a little education. You don't need a college degree, but you got to be literate so you can join the workforce. The bright eyes of kids that have had the hygiene, the good health, the education. That inspires me. And America could be a leader in that. For what we spent in Afghanistan, and you could argue if we needed to spend that $1 trillion or not in Afghanistan, we could have essentially whooped hunger on this planet. We could have built societies. Development aid is a practical investment. It's loving your neighbor, and it's also brand building. We spend, I don't know, $800 billion a year in our military, and we need a defense. But we have to look at that investment and do a cost-benefit analysis. What makes us safe? That's what defense dollars are for. One extra soldier overseas costs $1 million. Now, you need soldiers overseas, but what is the value of one extra soldier overseas compared to taking that $1 million and investing it in water systems for thirsty communities? It costs $5,000 to drill a well. You could drill 200 wells for $1 million. What makes America safer? One more soldier or 200 thirsty towns no longer thirsty? Imagine 200 thirsty villages where every morning the mothers, not the fathers, the mothers would abandon their families and walk for water. Now, with a well, thanks to the United States, they don't walk across the county, they walk across the square. And every morning when they walk across the square and they pump that life-giving water for their kids, what do they think? God bless America. God bless America. Every morning, all the moms in all those villages. I don't care what you think about love your neighbor. If you want a stable world, that is a pragmatic investment, a practical investment. Is it ever going to happen? Not as long as all of our investments have to turn around and help industries back home. It's got to be a true investment. And then we can make our world a more stable place. I'm so excited about that. I've seen it. I've seen societies where when there's a big gap between rich and poor, people have to pool their resources to hire a private guard so their kids can walk down to the park and get a little exercise. When you've got an armed guard in front of every pharmacy, every hotel, and every bank, like in many places I've been in Latin America, you got too big a gap between rich and poor. This is coming to our community right now. We've got parts of our society where there's armed guards everywhere these days that weren't there in the past. This is important that we recognize the symptoms of a too big a gap between rich and poor and do something about it. This is a matter of who do you vote for. Even if you're wealthy enough to barricade yourself behind designer fortifications, if you know what's good for you, even if you're motivated only by greed, if you know what's good for you, you don't want to be filthy rich in a desperately poor world. It's not a nice place to raise your kids. This is something we've got to realize. You don't want to live behind fortifications. And we are a society that doesn't need to do that. We need to look into the eyes of these kids and recognize the value of helping other people. Oh my goodness. I've looked at this picture for years, and I just noticed there's a little girl under the fence. I can see her eyes cracking through underneath the fence. I love this shot. I love the chance to get out and humanize the world. And now I've got my own grandson, Atlas. And you might think, oh, baby, look at that. And my daughter is so filled with joy because we've got a little grandson. And there's Atlas now. Brings me so much joy. You may think, oh, okay, this will bring me back down to earth and I'll know what's really important, what's close to home. No, I believe in a God. And if you believe in a God, you know we're all children of a heavenly Father. And that makes us all family. And when we travel, we get to know the family. And when we recognize that we're all brothers and sisters, we know that this parent's love of that child is just as precious and valuable as this parent's love of that child. No difference. No difference. This is what we like to teach, is this: humanize the world, get out of our comfort zone, recognize that we can bring home the greatest souvenir and be better citizens of this planet. Let me finish just with a quick example of one of my favorite tour guide teaching, and then we'll do some questions and answers. I love to get my travelers out of their comfort zone so that they can learn and go home a little less afraid. When I'm in Turkey, I love to connect my travelers with a dervish. He's one of these monks that whirls and whirls and whirls, you know. And I'll just paraphrase it really quickly. But I was in Turkey and I had 20 travelers and they were in the hotel, and I said, I'm going to look for a dervish so we can get to know what a dervish is all about. I found a dervish and I said, and I'm just paraphrasing this way in a fun way. Hi, I'm an American tour guide and I got 20 Americans at the hotel. We'd love to watch you pray. And he said, not a photo op, I'm a monk, you know, but if I can explain to you what I'm doing, I'll let you join me. So I said, great. Where? When? Sundown on his rooftop. We joined him. He comes out in his monk's robe. Merhaba. He says, welcome. I am a dervish. You Christians would probably call me a monk. My prophet is Mevlana. I think you call him Rumi. He's sort of the prophet of love, kind of like your St. Francis. Everybody can get their brains around St. Francis and Mevlana. 5 times a day, I whirl myself into a meditative trance. And I think about the teaching of Mevlana, and I want to do, through Mevlana, what I can to make this world a better place. I whirl. And he says, I plant my foot in my home and in my community, and the other foot goes around and it celebrates the diversity in God's great creation. One hand goes up to accept the love of our Heavenly Father. The other hand goes down like the spout on a tea kettle and showers God's love on his creation. And I whirl. And I whirl, and I lose myself in that thinking. And we watched him whirl, and we thought, what a beautiful thing. His head tilted over, his robe billowed out, and he lost himself in that meditation, connecting God with his creation, celebrating his hometown, his family, but at the same time celebrating the diversity in God's great creation. I looked over at my travelers, and I saw the wonder sweep over their faces, and I thought, this is good travel. My travelers are going to go home a little less afraid, a little more connected, and they're going to take that broader perspective and they're going to employ it as citizens of this great country of ours to make our world a better place. And if our travelers and if our travel experience can help us step into that voting booth and recognize that who wins this election will impact us, sure, but it will impact struggling people in our society and struggling people south of the border and the future far more. And if we can vote not for what makes us better off, but what makes all of us better off, if that can be our motivating factor, and if our travel experience can help us vote in that more enlightened way, I think that's making travel a political act. And that's something that I think has never been more important. I hope, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share with you, to sort through these ideas myself, because I didn't know quite what I was going to say this evening, and to be able to share with them with you. And I hope that the experiences I've had that have inspired me to take this election seriously and to take this election a little less selfishly, I hope that rubs off on you too. Thank you very much. And Gabe, I think we're ready for some questions.
Is that all, Rick?
That's all,
You,
Gabe.
you covered a lot. Um, all right. Well, I just want to remind people, I know that a lot of our viewers on the East Coast may need to get to bed, but we always post these recordings on both the Rick Steves Travel Talks YouTube channel and on the Monday Night Travel webpage. Usually we get them posted within 48 hours. We're going to try hard on this one to get it posted within 24 hours. So if you need to sign off, you can always catch up on the Q&A that you missed.
Nice.
Um, but otherwise, Rick, did you have a word from our sponsor before we get to our Q&A?
Well, I would say our sponsor is really just looking at the links that are in the chat section, and you'll get that email tomorrow with all of that. Educate yourself. I've enjoyed, working very hard through my travels when there's some issue that I like, the Holy Land, Iran, Hunger and Hope, fascism, this travel as a political act stuff. You've got all of that on our website for free. And I just hope that if people have friends around the country that might enjoy the stimulus that this presentation has provided, that they would encourage them to watch it and share it. Okay.
All right. Well, Rick, I don't think it'll surprise you that this may have been our liveliest Q&A widget presentation that we've had thus far. But I was getting through as many of them as I could and got some good questions for you. Our first question comes from another Rick. And Rick would like to know, as an American traveling in Europe, do you often get asked about American politics? And if you're maybe somebody that isn't used to talking about that a lot, how can you kind of be prepared to engage with Europeans on that topic?
Yeah, I always joke that if you want to start a conversation in Europe, learn how to explain the electoral college. That confuses a lot of Europeans. I remember I was getting a ride with a driver in Iceland this last summer, and I asked him how the politics are in Iceland, and he says, "Well, I don't. Ours are so boring. I just follow American politics. It's much more entertaining. Their politics are just pretty mundane, which is I kind of wish we had mundane politics. I think Europeans are fascinated and a little confused by our system, and it's great to just share. What's the impact of money in their elections compared to our elections? People don't understand the value, how we wash everything with money. It's just not that big a deal in Europe. People are very confused about the divided society. It's tragic in so many ways, and I think it saddens a lot of people. Europeans are a little confused because they see a lot more Democrats than Republicans generally, just in tourism in Europe. And you would get a kind of an unrealistic cross-section of America if you ran a B&B in Scotland and you thought that's the American public, because that's generally going to be a little bit skewed to the left. And I got to remind people, Europe skews to the left too. What is centrist in Europe would be liberal in our society. Europe is more comfortable with what we would consider liberal.
Another question comes from Robin, and Robin is wondering, do you find that European countries are as ethnocentric as the US can be? I know that oftentimes in the US we talk about our country being the best in the world.
Yeah.
Do you find a lot of European countries touting themselves as the best?
No, there's playful competition between Norway and Sweden or something like that, but no small country can be that ethnocentric. The old ugly American thing, that's not unique to America. When I think about who are the ugly countries, and I just say ugly is not evil, it's just they're naive and they're ethnocentric. They think they're the norm. It would be Germans, Americans, Indians, Chinese, and Russian. Those are the ones that are famous for being, thinking this is the norm. I want to do it my way. You don't find ugly Belgians or ugly Bulgarians or ugly Danes because they're small and they realize they're not the norm. But it's easy to be an American and think you're the norm. In fact, we celebrate that we're, we're, whatever the word is, we're unique or we're exceptional, American exceptionalism. You don't have Spanish exceptionalism or Czech exceptionalism, really.
We also have a question from Mayra who is wondering, what are your thoughts on travel boycotts? I know when we talk about politics and travel, we often get people that say, if I disagree with Orban in Hungary,
Yeah.
shall I travel there? Or if I disagree with a human rights situation in Iran, should I travel there?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
My thoughts
travel?
are pretty much against boycotts because, yes, I'd like not to favor that government with this money, but I want to spend money there that goes into local people. So I'd be more likely to spend my money carefully that it goes to locals. But what I would be most concerned about is if there is a need for a boycott, there's just as big of a need for people to connect. And when I go to Cuba, I'm connecting with people and they're learning what Americans are like. When I go to Russia, I'm connecting with people and they're learning what Americans are look like. And then for the rest of their lives, they'll remember, oh, I met that crazy travel writer that a few years ago. And that's their idea of what an American is. I like to think that when we travel, it makes it tougher for their propaganda to dehumanize us, and it makes it tougher for our propaganda to dehumanize them. And that's a beautiful thing about travel. It helps us, it inoculates us from being abused by agenda media.
You spoke about Cuba and Russia, and that kind of ties in with another question. I think you're no stranger to this question. Oftentimes, when you talk about fascism and you have your fascism special, we have people that always want to flip it to, well, what do you think about communism? And so Doug was asking that question. What are your thoughts on communism, Rick?
My thoughts are I like capitalism. I'm realistic. I'm the best capitalist in my town. I really believe I am. And what would distinguish me is I believe that government is necessary in capitalism to be the referee. If you have unbridled capitalism, it's not sustainable and it can get ugly. But if you have government providing the parameters and to be that referee, then you can have all the energy that capitalism creates, and you can have it in a way that is in a sustainable way, and it makes up for people who are not good at the game of capitalism. So I believe in capitalism, and I think Europe does also. But Europe is, when you think about socialism, socialism is tied with communism, but socialism is, we're all socialistic to a certain degree. We have retirement accounts, or we have insurance, or we have healthcare. That's socialistic. We have government paid for education. That's socialistic. Europe is more comfortable with social-ism. Europe likes the idea that you pay more taxes and the government provides the child care. Europe likes the idea that you pay the taxes and the government will make sure that nobody is homeless in their retirement. That's a safety net that Europeans can afford. The United States has this dog-eat-dog approach that, oh, if you don't have the fear of being destitute, you're not going to work that hard. I don't really buy that. I think a society needs to have those safety nets. But it's not right or wrong. It's just a philosophy of economics, but it's all within the bounds of capitalism. Extreme to the left, extreme to the right, basically they come to the same place, I think. Stalin and Hitler, who was worse? I don't want to answer that question. What would that accomplish? They were both, demons of the far left and the far right, I guess. So yeah, I'm not a fan of any extremism. I'm a fan of good governance and respecting that people will differ and finding a workable compromise.
And Rick, we have time for one more question tonight, and it comes from me. As I was kind of looking through the Q&A, as I said, it was very lively. We have a lot of people that feel passionately on a lot of different sides, and I know that you just provided a great example of thoughtfully and eloquently advocating for your points of view. I know you've said before that dissent is patriotic, and I'm wondering what would be your advice to Americans as they go through these next 40 some days about how to engage thoughtfully and share their views in ways that are going to be respectful but impactful?
To me, the enlightened voter is not worried about themselves. Let's put it this way, is worried about themselves in a more sophisticated way. I'm worried about myself being able to live in a beautiful community that lives together and takes care of people. That is the successful society in my mind. Do I want to have my ability to do everything my way so I can prosper and to hell with the rest of them? Or do I want to live within a society that works and plays together in a way that is sustainable and gives people dignity? And I just am pretty realistic about the downside of a society that has elites and desperation. What I want is a society that moderates that. It still lets people work hard and be smart and get ahead, but it moderates it and it gives people a safety net. I think what people could think about when they're approaching the election is what is good for the community, what is good for the poor, what is good for the future, and what is good for people south of the border. If you can take care of the poor, the community, the future, and south of the border, you don't need to worry about taking care of the rich people. The rich people will prosper because you've taken care of the poor people, the community, the future, and south of the border. I'm surprised at how readily we will abandon the future, ignore south of the border, and hollow out our communities so we can be having this advantage. Whether we like it or not, we're all in this together. And we need good governance. We are so richly blessed to be Americans, to have stability. I'm always thinking about that as a businessman, how great it is that I can scheme up something this year, plan for it next year, go do it the next year, bring it home and post-produce it the next year, and sell it to the public the next year, and I can start it and finish it with the same steady keel. That lets me be prosperous and successful as a businessman. If you lived in a world where you couldn't have that stability, you couldn't do all that good capitalistic stuff, and you'd be in trouble. So I'm really interested in that sustainability and that stability. I think that makes a lot of sense if you're thinking about how do I want to vote. Get away from voting just for yourself. And in actuality, you will be voting for yourself without even knowing it. And I love the idea, as I mentioned, that so many of us, people who, regardless of what your approach is to religion, you want to love your neighbor. It's the right thing to do. Care about your community. You can do that. And at the same time, you can look at that investment in that community as a practical investment that will bring back great returns. And I mentioned during my talk the sadness of having a dumbed down society and everything simplified to a bumper sticker. We have to be a little more savvy. And travel has taught me that you need to reach out. When my dad took me to the airport when I went down to El Salvador and Nicaragua and became politicized, he didn't say, "I love you, son." He said, "Don't be duped, son." He didn't want me to be duped. I love my dad. I'm so blessed to have the dad I had. But he was not very progressive. And he was so worried I'd come home some kind of a raving liberal, But I came home a person with a global point of view. And I think a better Christian, a better citizen, a happier person. Because I did that thing that Thomas Jefferson said, if you do this, you'll be wiser but less happy. I traveled. Gabe, what a great event. I'm so thankful so many people tuned in. Everybody, I don't think everybody knows, but when you and I have our postmortem, I always say, send me my late night reading. And I think that's reading all the comments. I read all of the questions. Every time I've done one of these, I read the entire list of questions, and I'm so thankful for the work that you and Ben do to answer a lot of those questions. And just happy travels, everybody. I'm sorry I went long, but this is an important topic, and I appreciate your attention, and we'll see you next Monday. All right?